What really happened in the Villisca Axe murders? The Villisca Axe murders, unraveling the 1912 horror. The crime scene, a portrait of horror. The house at 508 East 2nd Street, Villisca, Iowa, was in early June of 1912 an unremarkable structure. A modest, two-story white frame house with a neat porch. It stood on a quiet residential street, indistinguishable from its neighbors save for the lives lived within. Josiah B. Moore, a respected local businessman, and his wife Sarah, a diligent homemaker, had cultivated an ordinary, comfortable existence there for themselves and their 4 children. Herman, aged 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. On the evening of June 9th, their tranquility was amplified by the presence of 2 visitors, Lena and Inez Stillinger, sisters aged 12 and 8 respectively, who were spending the night after attending a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church. It was a picture of small-town domesticity, a scene universally recognizable, and it was this very normalcy that would be irrevocably shattered, transforming the house into a monument to unspeakable terror. When the neighbors finally forced entry the following morning, the domestic scene had been meticulously rearranged into a tableau of horror. 8 souls, from mature adults to innocent children, lay dead in their beds, their lives extinguished with a brutal, dispassionate efficiency that defied comprehension. Josiah and Sarah Moore were found in the master bedroom downstairs, their faces beaten beyond recognition. Upstairs in a smaller bedroom lay the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Inez, their small bodies similarly mutilated. In a third bedroom, Josiah and Sarah's 4 children were discovered, each having met the same horrific end. The weapon, a common axe belonging to Josiah Moore himself, was found leaning against a wall in the downstairs bedroom, its blade still slick with the gore of 8 lives. Yet it was not merely the staggering death toll or the savage nature of the killings that curdled the blood. It was the chilling, almost ritualistic arrangement of the scene. Every window in the house, regardless of whether it faced the street or the backyard, had been meticulously covered with curtains, blankets, or clothing, sealing the horror within, away from prying eyes or perhaps from the last sliver of moonlight. Mirrors, too, had been carefully draped with fabric, as if to deny the atrocity its own reflection, or to prevent any lingering spirits from witnessing the aftermath. Lamps and lanterns, essential in a time before widespread electricity, were discovered in various rooms, their chimneys carefully removed and placed beside them, suggesting the killer had operated in the dim, flickering light, a deliberate act to obscure, not illuminate. Bafflingly, despite the opportunity, there was no sign of forced entry into the house. The doors were found locked from the inside, suggesting either that the killer had been let in by a trusting victim, or had possessed a key, or perhaps had meticulously resecured the dwelling upon departure. Wallets and jewelry, readily available, remained untouched, eliminating robbery as a primary motive. In the kitchen, a plate of uneaten food sat on the table, and in the children's rooms, clothes were laid out for the following day, mundane details that amplified the suddenness and finality of the attack. The sheer brutality of the assault on each victim spoke of a profound, visceral rage, yet the methodical covering of windows, draping of mirrors, and removal of lamp chimneys suggested a chilling self-possession, a meticulousness that bordered on the ceremonial. The contrast between the visceral violence and the quiet, almost domestic rearrangements created a terrifying dissonance, a portrait of horror that was not merely chaotic, but deeply, unsettlingly deliberate. The house, once a haven of family life, had become a sealed tomb, a stage upon which a monstrous act was performed, leaving behind only questions, blood, and an unbearable silence. the unbearable silence of the Moore house shattered with the rising sun. The horror, once confined to sealed rooms, bled out into the nascent light of June 10th, contaminating the very air of Villisca. Frank F. Jones, the Moore's neighbor, peering into a window, saw only the dreadful stillness, the untouched breakfast on the table, and the uncharacteristic quiet. When he dispatched his brother-in-law, Ross Moore, no relation, to investigate, the small town's fragile peace dissolved. Ross Moore's entry into the house was the first in a cascade of errors that would forever cloud the truth. He found Josiah and Sarah, their heads brutally caved in the downstairs bedroom. The screams that followed were not Ross Moore's, but those of his wife, Martha, who had accompanied him. Her piercing cries tore through the quiet morning, an alarm that instantly drew a throng. Villisca, a town of scarcely 2,500 souls, was built on close-knit connections, on shared rhythms and familiar faces. News of a death, let alone a massacre, spread not by telegraph, but by breathless whispers carried on the summer breeze, pulling residents like a dark magnet towards the unassuming white house on East 2nd Street. Within minutes, the street outside was a tableau of growing panic and morbid curiosity. The discovery of Lena and Inez Stillinger in the children's room upstairs, then the Moore children themselves, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, each in their own beds, equally horrifically dispatched, confirmed the unimaginable. 8 lives, extinguished in a single merciless act. What followed was a calamitous spectacle, a testament to the primitive state of criminal investigation in early 20th century America. Sheriff F.F. Jackson, the county's chief law enforcement officer, arrived shortly after the first alarm. Faced with a crime of unprecedented brutality, his immediate actions, or lack thereof, further compounded the disaster. The concept of securing a crime scene, of preserving delicate traces of evidence, was largely unknown, or at least entirely disregarded. The morbid fascination of the townspeople was allowed to run rampant. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals trampled through the Moore home that day. Men, women, and even children shuffled through the blood-stained rooms, peering into the faces of the deceased, touching the furniture, disturbing what little forensic potential remained. This chaotic influx ensured that any footprints of the killer were obliterated by 1,000 others. Fingerprints, even if the technology to properly lift and analyze them existed, which it barely did at this nascent stage of policing, would have been rendered useless by the countless hands that touched doorknobs, walls, and banisters. The axe itself, found leaning against a wall in the downstairs bedroom, its blade still coated in the dried, dark evidence of its purpose, was reportedly handled by multiple individuals before it was even formally taken as evidence. Souvenir hunters, a ghastly subset of the curious, were later alleged to have pilfered items: a piece of wood, a fragment of fabric, even grotesquely, a fragment of bone, further contaminating and depleting the already compromised scene. Sheriff Jackson, overwhelmed and unequipped, relied on local constables and volunteers. There were no specialized forensic teams, no dedicated state bureaus waiting to descend with methodical precision. Investigators from other jurisdictions, including Pinkerton detectives, would arrive in the coming days and weeks, but by then, the initial, crucial moments of the investigation had been drowned in a tide of well-meaning, but ultimately destructive public intrusion. In the wake of this informational deluge and evidentiary destruction, the search for a perpetrator began, grasping at the few discernible threads. The small town's collective mind, shattered by the atrocity, first turned to outsiders. The transient killer, the drifter passing through by rail, was an immediate, terrifying specter. Villisca was on a rail line, a conduit for the unknown. But quickly, the gaze turned inward. Josiah Moore, a well-respected but ambitious businessman, had dealings in coal and feed. Had he made enemies? Business rivals, disgruntled employees, or even local paramours became objects of intense, often baseless, speculation. The immediate suspect pool was less a carefully constructed list of investigative leads and more a reflection of a traumatized community, projecting its fears and suspicions onto anyone who seemed slightly out of place, or perhaps too familiar. The whispers began, weaving a tapestry of suspicion that would, for decades, ensnare local figures and obscure any semblance of a clear path to justice. The tapestry of suspicion woven by Villisca's terrified whispers began, almost immediately, to snag on specific threads, drawing certain figures into the grim spotlight. These were not always men with obvious motive, nor always men of ill repute, but rather individuals whose lives, for various reasons, became entangled with the horror of the Moore residents. Their names, still whispered in the town's quiet corners a century later, form the enduring, unresolved theories of the Villisca axe murders. Foremost among the local conjectures was the enmity between Frank F. Jones, a prominent state senator and businessman, and Josiah B. Moore. Jones, a respected if formidable figure in Villisca, was Moore's former employer. The relationship had soured after Moore left Jones's implement company to start his own, reportedly taking a lucrative John Deere dealership with him. Rumors of bitter rivalry, alleged financial disputes, and even threats exchanged between the two men circulated with the speed of wildfire through the stunned community. Some claimed Jones had explicitly threatened Moore, vowing to get even. While these assertions were often anecdotal and lacked concrete proof, the very prominence of Jones made him a compelling, if dangerous, target for public suspicion, feeding into the insidious notion that the darkness resided not in some faceless outsider, but within the very fabric of Villisca itself. Yet the sheer brutality and the enigmatic nature of the crime scene pushed investigators beyond local grievances, hinting at a more sinister, perhaps transient, force. This line of inquiry led to figures like William Mansfield. An English immigrant known as a drifter, Mansfield's name arose due to a chilling pattern of similar unsolved axe murders across the Midwest in the years surrounding the Villisca tragedy. He was eventually arrested and tried for the 1912 axe murders of his wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, a crime eerily similar in method to Villisca. Although Mansfield was acquitted due to an alibi provided by his brother, the shadow of a traveling killer lingered. The meticulous covering of windows, the axe as the weapon, the lack of robbery, these commonalities suggested a signature, a methodical predator operating under the cover of the vast, interconnected rail lines of early 20th century America. Another figure whose shadow momentarily brushed the Villisca case was Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims. Years after the Villisca tragedy, in 1916, Henry Lee Moore committed a series of brutal axe murders in Missouri, killing multiple families in their beds. The method was strikingly similar, bludgeoning sleeping victims with an axe, often covering the faces, and leaving behind a scene devoid of robbery but steeped in methodical violence. Was this a macabre coincidence, an independent emergence of a similar pathology, or did it point to a chilling, unseen network of these dark impulses, suggesting a deeper pattern that transcended individual cases? The question, like so many others, remained unanswered, a spectral echo across the rolling plains. But perhaps the most bizarre and convoluted theory centered on Reverend George Kelly. A traveling minister with a history of peculiar behavior, mental instability, and alleged predatory tendencies towards women, Kelly became a focus years later. His name first surfaced through private detective efforts, leading to a strange, whispered confession he purportedly made to a former prison cellmate. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested. Under intense interrogation, he confessed to the Villisca crimes, describing specific details that seemed to corroborate aspects of the crime scene. He claimed a divine mission had driven him to commit the acts, speaking of visions and a compulsion to punish the sinful. However, Kelly later recanted his confession, alleging police brutality and coercion. He was tried twice, the first resulting in a hung jury, the second in an acquittal. Kelly's volatile testimony, his strange demeanor, and the subsequent retraction left a bitter taste, casting doubt on the entire process and further fragmenting any hope of a definitive truth. Was he the deranged perpetrator, momentarily glimpsed before receding into the mists of psychiatric ambiguity, or a fragile mind broken by relentless pressure? These individual narratives coalesced into a broader, more amorphous concept, the transient killer theory. The notion that a single, unidentified individual, moving from town to town by rail, was responsible for a string of unsolved axe murders across the Midwest in the years 1911–1912. The similarities in modus operandi, the use of an axe, the covering of windows, the lack of forced entry, the absence of robbery, and the targeting of entire families, were too pronounced for some to dismiss as mere coincidence. Villisca, then, became just one stop on a phantom trail of blood, a testament to a predator that eluded capture not through cunning, but through constant movement, melting back into the anonymity of the open road and the labyrinthine rail networks after each strike. And beneath all these grand theories, the quieter, more insidious local conspiracy theories continued to fester. Whispers of jealousy, revenge stemming from forbidden love affairs, secret societies, or even dark business dealings continued to circulate. The small-town nature of Villisca meant that everyone knew everyone, and every slight, every perceived injustice could be magnified into a potential motive for such a heinous act. These theories, often fueled by fear and suspicion, pointed to the unseen currents of human vice and malice, suggesting that the monster wasn't a drifter, a preacher, or a rival businessman, but perhaps a collective entity born from the town's own hidden secrets. The immediate aftermath and the ensuing years were less a focused investigation, and more a sprawling, chaotic entanglement of theories, accusations, and fleeting shadows. Each suspect, each theory, offered a tantalizing glimpse of closure, only to dissolve into the pervasive silence of the unsolved, leaving Villisca not with answers, but with a terrifying abundance of unanswered questions. The terrifying abundance of unanswered questions that settled over Villisca was not merely a consequence of the perpetrator's cunning. It was a testament to the primitive, often chaotic state of justice itself in the early 20th century. The methods of inquiry, rudimentary even by the standards of the time, were ill-equipped to grapple with a horror of such magnitude, leaving a void where clarity should have been. The Villisca house, soaked in death, swiftly became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious. Hundreds tramped through the blood-spattered rooms, their boots grinding potential evidence into the floorboards, their eager fingers smudging surfaces that might have held clues. There was no perimeter, no protocol for preservation. Law enforcement, consisting primarily of the local sheriff and a handful of deputies, found themselves overwhelmed, their limited understanding of crime scene integrity compounded by a town gripped by panic and a desperate need for understanding. The era possessed no reliable fingerprinting techniques for such a chaotic scene, no advanced forensic chemistry. It was a time of intuition, rumor, and blunt force interrogation, and in Villisca, these tools proved tragically inadequate. The initial investigation, thus, was less an excavation of truth and more a frantic sifting through already disturbed earth, each well-meaning but ignorant step further burying the answers. As the immediate shock subsided, the search for a culprit devolved into a morass of local feuds and political maneuverings. Josiah Moore, a man of some local standing, had made enemies. The whispers of business rivalries, land disputes, and personal grievances soon overshadowed the chilling impersonality of the crime scene. Powerful figures within the community, wary of their reputations or eager to deflect suspicion, exerted subtle and not-so-subtle pressures. The investigation became a distorted mirror, reflecting Villisca's own dark undercurrents back upon itself. Grand juries were convened, witnesses called, theories aired, but the procedural machine, burdened by a lack of concrete evidence and an abundance of conflicting narratives, ground to a halt repeatedly. Suspects were identified, interrogated, and released. One particular figure, the aforementioned state senator Frank F. Jones, a known antagonist of Josiah Moore, found himself repeatedly entangled in the investigatory web, yet the political influence wielded by such men proved an impenetrable shield, adding layers of opaque complexity to an already bewildering case. In the vacuum of official progress, private detectives, often driven by sensationalism and the lure of reward money, entered the fray. Some, like the famed Detective James Newton Wilkerson, introduced entirely new, often conflicting, theories and suspects, sometimes even attempting to manufacture evidence. Their involvement, while perhaps offering fleeting hope to a desperate public, ultimately served to muddy the waters further, creating a labyrinth of accusations and counter-accusations from which no clear path emerged. The pursuit of justice became a battle of narratives, each competing for public credence, none strong enough to stand the scrutiny of a courtroom. Early prejudices also cast their long, dark shadow. Unsubstantiated claims, rooted in racial bias, briefly targeted African American transients, an easy and convenient scapegoat for a terrified white community unable to comprehend such an atrocity from within its own ranks. This fleeting, baseless focus was another stark reminder of the human tendency to seek easy answers in the face of the unimaginable, further diverting precious resources and attention from the real, elusive killer. Decades would pass. Grand juries would be impaneled and dissolved. Trials would be held, most notably against Reverend George Kelly, a man whose confession and subsequent recantation haunted the later years of the investigation. Yet, despite the efforts, however flawed, no one was ever successfully prosecuted for the Villisca axe murders. The legal system, designed to deliver closure, instead became an echo chamber of unresolved questions, its failures amplifying the horror rather than diminishing it. The absence of a definitive conclusion hung heavy, a perpetual accusation against the very fabric of the community that had failed to protect its own, and then failed to avenge them. The silence that had descended upon the Moore house that June night continued to reverberate through the halls of justice, a chilling testament to the elusive nature of truth when confronted by profound darkness.